Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining me today. If you cannot hear me, just go ahead and add it in the chat. Nicole's going to go ahead and start recording this. So if you want to watch it or share it with somebody else later, you can do that because we will have it recorded. So the purpose of today's virtual training is just to go over some tips and strategies for better understanding challenging behavior. I'm Tara Warwick. I'm an occupational therapist. One of my favorite quotes is this: you can't teach children to behave better by making them feel worse. When children feel better, they behave better. And so I think about when I work with kids, the first thing I want to do is make sure that they're happy and they want to be there with me. Because if they don't, then they're not going to learn. And so, just thinking about challenging behavior, and, everybody on here are related service providers, but, working with teachers and working with parents to make sure that the kids are happy and they want to be there first. So this is another one of my favorite quotes is if a child doesn't know how to read, we teach them to read. If a child doesn't know how to swim, we teach them to swim. If a child does not know how to multiply, we teach them to multiply, and so on. If a child doesn't know how to behave, what do we typically do? We typically punish. But we need to really think about this and why we can't finish that last sentence like we do others, that when a child does not know how to behave, we need to teach them. So thinking about behavior as what skill are they missing and what do we need to teach? So we do know within the context of the school that children who exhibit challenging behaviors are considered at risk of academic failure, delinquency, dropping out, gang membership, and adult incarceration. And so this just shows us the importance of addressing challenging behavior, because if we don't, kids are a lot more risk for all these things. We also know that 10 to 15% of all typically developing preschool have chronic to mild, moderate levels of behavior problems. So there's a lot of kids that need support in the area of challenging behavior. What we do know also that works, there's a lot of research behind positive behavior supports. So if this is a new term to you, I would highly recommend that you go to the PBIS website that's there on your screen. PBS is research-based, so it brings a lot of gaps or a lot of approaches together. It focuses on data-based decisions, so it looks at decisions more objectively versus just us wanting to do this or having a preference for that. It helps us use the data. It also looks on the environment as well as the child. So versus us just focusing on we want to change this child or we want to stop this child's behavior, it helps us to think about the environment. The other thing that positive behavior support does is it focuses on that replacement skill. So thinking about what you want the child to do versus just stopping the challenging behavior. So there's a lot of great resources on, when you look at PBIS, positive behavior intervention supports. So thinking about how do we all work together and using this as you're working with teachers and other team members and parents on behavior, the process that I'm going to go through today is a way that it can help us stay more objective when we're working and addressing challenging behaviors. So the first thing is taking our judgment out of the behavior. So that's what I'm going to go through is how do we stay more objective? Thinking about behavior as communication. So, and it serves a purpose that when kids are having challenging behaviors, they're trying to tell us something, and that it for some is serving some sort of function for them. And it continues because it's reinforced. And this is a message I have to use a lot with teachers, is that, even if you think you're punishing the child by putting them in timeout or by taking away recess, if the behavior keeps happening, probably what's happening is that they are getting reinforced for that. So we have to think about, is what we're doing helping? Is it making the behavior, the same? Is it decreasing the behavior? To help us understand that behavior. We also think about teaching the alternative skill. So once again, going back to What is it that they need to do? What do they need to learn how to do versus just stopping that behavior? And also, we all have to look at those environmental concerns. So what are things that are going around, in the environment that is impacting that behavior? So, sorry. Okay, sorry guys. Okay, so some components to consider here. Does the child know the expectations? So when you're looking at, maybe you're working with a child, or maybe you are, you're working with a teacher on the child and there's a lot of issues. These are some questions that you might ask. Does the child know the expectations? Do I have things that the child likes? So a big part of all this is making sure we have things that the child is motivated by. What skills does this child, what am I missing? Do I need to add more visuals? And am I using too much language? And we're going to get to the end of this. We're going to look at some strategies, but those are just some things to consider. This is just a quote that I think is kind of funny. It's like, I wouldn't say your son is bad at school. He's just gifted at disruptive behavior. So the students have had a lot of practice at some of these behaviors. And so the definition for challenging behavior is any repeated pattern of behavior or perception of behavior that interferes with or risk of interfering with optimal learning or engagement in pro-social interactions with peers and adults. So thinking about what behavior is impacting that child's participation in activities. And it doesn't always have to be that real external behavior as far as maybe hitting, kicking. It might be that the student is just kind of checking out, or they're not responding to instructions. Those might be behaviors. So sometimes those are the kids that kind of fall between the cracks, is the kids that have more of those kind of silent type behaviors. So thinking about what is it that's impacting that child's participation. Think about behavior as information. So don't put a lot of judgment on the behavior. Just think about it as, this is the way this child can communicate a need that needs to be met. Okay, think about, this is the information they're supplying us. You have kids who have trouble with communication, trouble with social skills, trouble with emotional regulation, and their behavior might be the only tool that they have to communicate what they need. Okay, so really trying to keep it as objective as possible. Another funny one, perhaps his behavior has not changed because your behavior has not changed, but that's none of my business. So thinking about this is that, if you really want behavior to change, we're the ones that have to change first. Okay, we either have to change what we're doing, the environment, but we're the ones that really have to change to see behavior change. So this process of, really understanding challenging behavior starts by us identifying the specific behavior we want to address. And that sounds simple, but it can be really hard, is thinking about it in more specific terms. So avoiding words like meltdown, aggression, disengaged, hyperactive, inattentive, all those things can vary significantly from child to child. So a meltdown to me might mean something very different than a meltdown to you. So we want to make it a little bit more clear. Thinking about, could anybody come in and see that behavior? So if a stranger, walking around could identify the behavior that you're wanting to address. When I'm going through this process, I only typically pick a couple behaviors. So I'm not picking every single thing that behavior that child might do. Also, if you have a child whose behavior starts one way and then it escalates, I had a child that would start by, his first behavior was he would put his head in his hoodie. And then if we didn't address it then, it would get worse. He would start pacing back and forth. And if we didn't address there, he would start throwing chairs and throwing desks, and it just escalated from there. So the behavior that we're going to identify is putting his head in his hoodie. We're going to start with that first behavior instead of waiting until that behavior escalates. The other thing during this time is to not hypothesize. So try to really keep it objective. Just tell me exactly what the behavior is. He hits, he kicks, he doesn't respond to a question within so many seconds. I'm not saying he's trying to get my attention by hitting me. I'm not putting a judgment into the behavior yet. I'm not thinking about why right now, all I'm doing is gathering objective information about the behavior. I want to just see exactly what is happening. So we start by identifying the behavior. So here's an example. When transitioning from breakfast in the morning to reg time, Jacob will run around the room until the teacher tells him to, until the teacher can physically stop him. When she stops him, he starts hitting her and kicking her until she takes him into the hallway, sits him down, and makes him wait. Okay, so the behavior here I'd want to address would be running around the room. Okay, that would be the first one I would start because that's where that behavior starts. I also might address hitting and kicking, okay, because that might happen at other times of the day too. Another example, during free play time, Sam will walk up to the puzzles, throw the puzzle pieces at Piers until the teacher takes him to the table by himself. When he's at the table by himself, he will start screaming at the teacher until he's removed from the classroom and taken to the principal's office. Okay, so the behavior here that I would want to identify is, throwing the puzzle pieces. Okay, that's exactly the behavior I want to address. I want to address throwing the puzzle pieces. And then I also might look at screaming. Okay, and just making sure that everybody understands what screaming that we're looking at. So once I've identified this is the behavior that is impacting the day for this child, the next thing is I'm going to gather some objective information about the day, about the behavior. This could happen real quick, or it might have to happen over a period of time. So for some students who have pretty complicated behaviors, or they've been doing behaviors for a long time, you're going to probably have to gather more data. So, over maybe a couple weeks or even longer than that. For some kids, you can do this in the moment where I'm just, okay, this is the behavior, this is what happened before, and this is what happened after. Another quote I really like is, the biggest communication problem is we do not listen to understand, we listen to reply. So making sure that before, you have a teacher coming to you or a parent coming to you about challenging behavior, you're not just throwing strategies at them by saying, if he won't sit in circle time, you're not just saying, oh, well, try this, try that. Instead, pausing for a moment, really listening and gathering objective information about the behavior before we ever think about recommending any strategies. Okay, we have to get to the why before we start throwing strategies at people. Okay, because the strategies will not work if we don't have the right why. Okay, if I'm trying to get a kid to sit in circle time and I'm throwing sensory strategies at them and it's not working, it might not be that the strategies aren't working, it's that for this kid it's not working because he can't sit still because he's not motivated, he doesn't have structure. So I want to make sure that I know the why before I just throw strategies at kids. So when I'm gathering objective information, I want to think about those ABCs of the behavior. Collect some data and maybe use the motivation assessment scale. I'll show you some of those. The ABC is, and many of you guys are probably familiar with this term, but it's just looking at, what is the antecedent, what is the behavior, and what is the consequence. So the antecedent is anything that happens before the behavior. So maybe it's you told them to do something, maybe it's you took something away, maybe it's the bell rang. Okay, and then the behavior we already identified, and then the consequence would be what happened afterwards. Okay, so when I took away the iPad, he hit me, and the consequences, I put him in timeout. Okay, so right now, once again, we are not putting any kind of hypothesis on the behavior right now. We're just gathering data. We're just saying when these things happen, when this is the antecedent, this behavior happens, and here's the consequence. So we're just trying to gather information so that way we can see, why is this happening? Okay, so like I said, your antecedents, what happens before. It might be not just an event, it could be just the environment or lack of activity. So some people will say, well, nothing was happening before. It's like, well, then that's your antecedent. Nothing was happening. There was a lack of activity going on, and then he started running around the room. Okay, maybe you took away a desired item, there's unstructured activity. Those are all different examples. Start thinking about some of these common threads with antecedents. So see if there's any patterns. So you might start noticing, oh, well, when he doesn't have structure or something to do, he has these challenging behaviors. So our plan would be, let's put more structure in place. Okay, so seeing what kind of patterns there are with the antecedents. And then behavior, we talked about that. So we have our specific behavior. And then the consequence, still not making any assumptions about this, but thinking about what happened right after the behavior. Okay. So no judgment on this. Like everybody's like, well, I tried this or tried that. Don't think about it as a judgment. Just think about what happened after the behavior. Well, you took away something. You put him in timeout. You verbally reminded him to do it. You gave him some choices. What is it that happened? And with this, we're starting to think once again, what are some patterns? When I give him more attention, does it get worse or does it get better? Okay. When I take away an activity, does he do it more often? All these things are going to help us better understand the why behind the behavior. So thinking about that reaction, how did they react? Did it get worse, better, no change? When you did put different consequences in place. This is a nice tool for gathering data. I'll email this out as well as the PowerPoint and the handouts. But I like this one because it's a real simple ABC sheet to where you can collect some data over time. So you just check off what happened before, what was the behavior, and what happened after. So let's look at the components here. When transitioning from breakfast in the morning to reg, Jacob will run around the room until the teacher can physically stop him. When she stops him, he starts hitting her and kicking her until she takes him in the hallway, sits him down, and makes him wait. Okay, so the antecedent would be, transitioning into reg time, right? The behavior is he runs around the room until the teacher can physically stop him. The consequence is, she physically stops him. And then did it get worse or better? It got worse. Okay. So then we go back again, whenever the antecedent now is whenever the teacher physically stops him, the behavior now is he hits and kicks her. And then the consequence is she takes him out to the hallway, sits him down, and makes him wait. Okay. So thinking about that, about what eventually got him possibly what he was wanting for that reason for the behavior. Okay. So we talked about direct observation, checklists and scales like that example that I gave you. And then the other one is this motivation assessment scale. I like this a lot too. You can Google this and it's free online. And it just, the key part about this is making sure that you're only filling it out about one behavior. Okay, so if I'm going to fill out these questions, I'm only going to look at maybe hitting, and I'm only going to answer each question only about hitting. So, and then what it does is at the end, I think there's 13 questions on it. You add up the columns, and whatever column has the highest number is the most likely reason for the behavior. So on the back side of the sheet, it's like, it's for attention, something tangible, self-stim, or escape, I think. And so whatever's the highest, that gives you the most likely reason for that behavior. So this is a great tool if you're really struggling with knowing the reason why behind the behavior. So we have identified the behavior that we're going to address. We've looked at what happens before, what happens after. We're really starting to think about, are we seeing any patterns? Okay, because ultimately what we want is a pretty solid why. We want to think about what is he trying to tell us through this behavior. Okay, so never, like I said earlier, never start an intervention or a strategy without a hypothesis. This could happen really fast, or it might happen over time. It could be like in the moment, you're like, well, I gave him an assignment, it was too hard. Or, he tore it up and I gave him a break. Well, he's trying to tell me that he needs help. Okay, so I was able to do that really quickly. There might be some where it's really hard and you have to do it over time and collect more data. So the hypothesis is an educated guess as to why that behavior is happening, and thinking about what are they getting or not getting out of the behavior. Why does it keep happening? How are we keep reinforcing it? Like, why is it still happening? When treatment planning, we have to start with a hypothesis. And this is, like I said earlier, this is a step we skip a lot, is we just start throwing strategies at kids and at teachers instead of really coming at the why and thinking about the why. Thinking about there's no right or wrong answers until we test it. So a hypothesis is just a guess as to why the behavior is happening. We don't know if it's right or wrong until we put some strategies in place to see if it works or not. There's also the possibility of multiple. So I have kids that I work with that they have one skill or one tool in their toolbox, and maybe it's hitting, and hitting might mean 20 different things. It means I need a break, I need help, I'm bored. I also have kids that have about 10 behaviors, and that all mean the same thing. Like I'll hit, I'll kick, I'll pinch, all to say I need a break. Okay, so thinking about that, you're really going to have to look at the context of the behavior to really to understand the hypothesis. So, all behaviors can fit into I'm either trying to get something or I'm trying to get away from something. I might be trying to get attention from somebody, something tangible. Maybe I'm trying to get a sensory need met, or I might be trying to get away from attention, from tangible, from something sensory. So thinking about that in your mind is like, how is this behavior, how am I hypothesizing this? Are they trying to get something, or are they trying to get away from something? Okay, there's some examples. Maybe it's favorite food, maybe it's attention from the teacher, maybe it's laughing from the peers. Sensory, maybe I need a walk, deep pressure, some kind of noise. So how do we formulate this hypothesis? Thinking about making sure you have enough objective information. Okay, you're going to want to collect objective information until you feel like you have a pattern. And once you have that pattern, you can say, oh my gosh, I see it now. I see this pattern. I see every time we place a demand on him, he has behaviors. Well, so that means that behavior is telling you that he's trying to say, I need a break from this. Okay. Some conclusions about, certain antecedents that are happening more often, certain consequences. Are there any certain sensory needs that are happening more often? Thinking about what makes it stop, what makes it worse. All those things are questions that you'll want to know when you're trying to formulate this hypothesis. Here's a way that you can analyze it. Just an example. So we know antecedents that might prevent. Maybe when I prepare for a transition, I give him something he wants to do when waiting, remind of expectations. All those things might help prevent. Or maybe antecedents that might trigger is when it's unstructured, waiting, there's a new activity, we took away a reward. So you can start looking at, what are things that if I put in place prevent it, and what are things that trigger that behavior. So looking at the consequences, what are consequences that stop the behavior, and what are consequences that make the behavior stay the same or intensify? So when I put them in timeout, it stops, okay? However, every time we go back to working again, it keeps happening. Maybe if I took away a reward, it got worse. Okay, maybe verbal reprimand, when I gave him more verbal attention, it got worse. So you would take the consequences that you've seen and kind of analyze to see, does this consequence make it stop, or does it make it intensify? So this is an example that you might write a hypothesis. And like I said, this could be done formally through an FBA, a functional behavior assessment, or it could be done informally. So when presented with difficult math, Jacob might pinch until the teacher removes the work. Okay, in order to gain sensory input, Jonathan might squeeze his para to get deep pressure. Okay, so thinking about how you can write that, and write it in a way that it's testable. Okay, don't write it in a way where when he doesn't get enough sleep at night, he has more behaviors. We can't test that, right? We can't make him sleep at night. So we want to make sure that these are things that we can control within the school setting, that these are things that we can test. Okay, when transitioning from breakfast, Jake will run around until I physically stop him. When she stops him, he starts hitting her and kicking her until she takes him into the hallway, sits him down, and makes him wait. So thinking about, what is Jacob trying to tell us through this? Okay, we do know that, when it's morning reg time, that transition, he runs around when she stops him. And then when she stops him, he starts hitting her. Okay, until what eventually calms him down is taking him to the hallway. So thinking about what, he might be trying to tell us, I need a break. Okay, so instead of having his behavior determine when he gets the break, let's teach him a replacement skill by teaching him how to ask for a break. Okay, or let's also make sure that he's motivated to sit there. Maybe he doesn't know the expectations for circle time. So let's break those down into smaller steps, and let's motivate him for sitting in circle time. And thinking about, Sam with puzzles. When Sam will walk up to the puzzles, throw them at the peers until the teacher takes him to a table by himself. When he's at the table, he will start screaming at the teacher until he's removed. Okay, so thinking about, what is he trying to tell us here? Maybe he's trying to tell us he wants attention from the teacher. So let's provide attention ahead of time, instead of waiting until that behavior happens. Okay, so testing that hypothesis. So once we've come up with a hypothesis, so we're saying we think that he's doing this in order to escape a task. We think he's doing this in order to get a break, or maybe he's doing this in order to gain some structure. This is where we test it by putting some hypothesis, by putting some strategies in place. So I'm going to go through some. These are probably pretty familiar to you, but you know, using these with some of the teachers or parents that you support, just to make sure that we have these in place. You know, thinking about, do we need to add some more visuals, some more structure with some picture schedules? Maybe the child's having trouble transitioning and they need to see what's coming up. So do we need to add some more picture schedules, some more first then, like first this, then that, to make it very clear what the expectations are? Maybe a cue card to teach some of those breaks or transitions. Maybe a visual timer to show that child how long until a transition is going to happen, or how long until, you know, maybe until they're done with the reinforcer. I've also used a lot of 5-point scales visually to show, to help children start understanding where they're at on that scale. So maybe a 1 is I'm happy, a 5 is I'm out of control. A lot of kids that we work with, you know, they seem to go from happy to complete mad, and not like from a 1 to a 5. And so if we can teach them, you know, how it feels when they're at that 2 and that 3, in a way to communicate that can help reduce a lot of challenging behavior. Modifying the expectations. So a lot of behaviors that we see in the schools is around the work. And so if you're seeing it in the classroom a lot, or when expectations are placed on them, thinking about either reducing the amount, modifying it, maybe breaking it into smaller steps. Maybe it's just too overwhelming to them. Even if it's a kid that you're like, I know he knows how to do it. Well, maybe he doesn't know how to do it today. So we're going to have to meet them where they're at today, to help them, you know, with the academics. Providing some choices with that. So, you know, do you want to do the odds or the evens? Do you want to do the first one, or do you want me to do the first one? Any kind of negotiating like that can be helpful. Avoid statements that start with can and will. So, oh, sorry, what happened here? Sorry, I went a different side. So when we're modifying, break into smaller steps, talking less, especially when you see behavior start to escalate, keep your instructions really simple. Talk less, really to the point. Prompt them to complete quickly. So instead of just keep repeating the instruction to them, help them do it right, and then reward them for that. Because whenever they are making mistakes and they're avoiding the activity, then it's less time that they're working. So if we can help them quickly to get it right, we can get more work out of them. Maybe you shorten the time expectations. So maybe we're going to do 1 minute to work, 1 minute to break. So we're, instead of trying to fight them the whole time to stay there, let's get a good solid 1 minute, and then we'll come back to it. Thinking about the type of instruction that you're providing, thinking about instruction versus feedback. So instruction needs to be really clear and simple, just a couple words. And your feedback is what you provide after they do the activity. So that's when you can use a lot of language, but making sure that, like I said, simple, direct, especially if you see their behavior starting to escalate. Okay, that's when you need to make sure we're really direct. Avoid those repeating instructions. Like I said earlier, give it one time, help them get it right, and then gradually you can reduce how much help that you're providing. Give them some choices. Okay, so like if I'm working with a kid and he wants the iPad, I'm like, okay, do you want to work on the iPad for 1 minute or 2 minutes? Okay, when you can provide those choices, it can help alleviate some of those power struggles. Avoid statements that start with can and will. So when you're giving them instructions, instead of saying, can you come over here, or will you, just say first sit, then iPad, or whatever it might be. But when we use can and will, we're really asking them. We're saying a yes and no question. Say, can you come over here? Yes, but I'm not going to. Or will you sit down? Nope, I sure won't. But then what do we do? We follow up with it with, yes, you need to do it. Okay, so it gets frustrating for them. So just tell them exactly what you want. And then avoid that no and stop. Those no and stop can be big trigger words for kids with challenging behaviors. especially who've had a lot of challenging behaviors. They've heard that a lot. And that could just be trigger words. When they hear no, they shut down or they start having challenging behaviors. So instead, you can redirect them and say, remind them what they are supposed to do, or just help them do it. Thinking about those alternative behaviors to teach them. So making sure, like, is there, do we need to teach some more communication skills? Do they know how to ask for a break? Do they know how to ask for help? Self-regulation. So that 5-point scale that I talked about earlier, where it gives them a way to communicate, how they're feeling. Is it a social skill? So maybe they're doing it to gain the attention of their peers or to participate in a social activity. How can we teach them the appropriate way to do that? Waiting is another big one. So there's so much waiting that happens in schools, and wait time is death time for kids with challenging behaviors. And so if thinking about, do we need to focus on waiting or give them something else to do during times that they have to wait? Do they know how to follow simple instructions? If not, maybe we need to break that down for them and just start working on one-step directions at a time. And then the organizational skills, like, are they getting really stressed with how to organize their locker and their desk? And that's causing some behaviors, or they're losing stuff. How can we help them with that? Thinking about a big one is positive reinforcement. So, this is a place I usually start when I'm having a student with a lot of challenging behaviors, is I start by making sure I have things that they like and that I'm using that. So if you're in this situation, I would highly, highly encourage you to start by finding out what motivates that kid. Okay. And, positive reinforcement is when I add something, following a behavior I want to see. So positive reinforcement is different than bribery. Bribery is when you give them something to stop a behavior. So you're in Walmart, kid falls on the floor, and you say, stop having a meltdown and I'll give you that Snickers bar. That's bribery, right? That's teaching them that if you want something, you just have challenging behaviors and I'll give it to you. Okay. So that encourages more of the challenging behaviors. Positive reinforcement is, I'm going to, reward you, every time we get something, every 5 items that I put in my grocery cart, I'm gonna give you a check mark. When you get 3 check marks, you get Snickers bar. Okay, so I'm rewarding you for the behavior I want to see versus just giving you something to stop the challenging behavior. So some tips on positive reinforcement. It needs to occur after the desired behavior. And then initially it needs to happen often. So none of this, if you're good all week, you get 30 minutes on the computer. Okay, kids will not tie that to the reinforcement to the behavior. You won't see a change in the behavior that way. So it's better to do smaller, more frequent. So instead of saying you get 30 minutes at the end of the day of computer, I would rather it be you're going to get 1 to 2 minutes, throughout the day. So smaller, more frequent. Eventually, intermittent is the best way to help behavior change, is by kind of random, where it's like you're catching them being good in the moment. Use bigger reinforcers for harder tasks. So if it's something that is more difficult or maybe new for them, bring out the big guns. Make sure they're the good reinforcers, those things that they like the most. A reinforcer has to be individual to each child. Okay, so if I said I was going to pay you in rice instead of money, or beans instead of money, it wouldn't go very far, right? And so that's like telling a kid who has no interest in a sticker that they get to earn a sticker. Okay, it has to be something that is meaningful to that child or it will not work. The more variety, the better. So if you have a kid who only likes has one reward that they like, try to find other ways to motivate them. Because I've seen it where I've had kids that have one thing that they like and we use it all the time. And then we wake up one day and they don't like it anymore. And then you're like, oh my gosh, what do we use now? One rule that I like is the 50% rule. And so a lot of times people say, how often do I give them access to their rewards, or how often do I give them a star, or, whatever it might be? Using the 50% rule, you look at how often the behavior happens. You divide that in half, and that's how often they need access to a reward. So an example might be the child is working through a worksheet and they get through half of the worksheet and they tear it up. Using the 50% rule, I'd want to go through a fourth of the worksheet and make sure they have access to some kind of reward, and going on from there. So, or if it's like maybe they can sit in circle time for 2 minutes and then he gets up and runs around, I'd want to make sure and give him positive reinforcement after 1 minute. Making sure you're using visuals too, it helps make things a little bit more objective and shows them. So a lot of kids have trouble giving up a reward because they don't know if they're going to get it back again. Okay, so because you just take it away and it's gone. But if you can take it away and say, okay, when you get 5 check marks, you can get it back again, it helps with that transition process because they can see when they get access to it again. So that's like delayed gratification. So instead of them getting the computer every single time they do a behavior, now it's, you know, I'm teaching them when you get 5 stars, you know, when you get, you know, so many points, you get access to a reward. So you're starting to teach them that delayed gratification. And this is a great way to help fade reinforcement over time, is by giving them a visual or some kind of system that shows them how much work they have to do in order to get access to the reward. Okay, so the last part on here is thinking about instructional control. And this is where I see it being really hard to, especially if you're working maybe in a therapy session or you're working with a teacher on an academic activity, is gaining this instructional control. And so here's some 7 tips for gaining instructional control. So number 1, like I said earlier, you know, making sure you have reinforcement, okay, so you can work for it. Okay, if they're begging for the iPad or they're digging out of your closet trying to find that favorite toy, get that toy out, but just show them that they can work for it. Okay, make it easy for them. Get 5 stars, you get access to it. You do this one thing, you get access to it. But they get access to it when they're doing the work at the table or wherever it is the behavior that you want to see. Number 2, you are fun. So pairing things that they like with you or the teacher, or if they're having trouble with somebody, making that person the fun person. Okay, like I said in the beginning, if kids aren't happy, they're not learning. And so we want to make them happy. I had one kid that I work with, and he, for some reason, there was a pair in the school that he just did not like for some reason. And he would see her, and every time he saw her, he would just take off running because he didn't like her for some reason. So what we did is we paired her with his favorite item, and it was scuba stuff. And so we gave her scuba stickers, and every time he saw her now, instead of just running off, she was giving him something he really liked, which was these scuba stickers. So we started pairing her with those things to teach him that she's a good person and you can have fun with her. Number 3, be consistent and follow through. So if you're going to give an instruction, follow through with it and be consistent. Okay. But make sure what you're telling them to do is something that they can do. Okay, so for example, if you're wanting them to sit in circle time and you know they can't sit in the whole circle time, don't tell them to sit in circle time the whole time. Maybe you're going to sit for 1 song and then you're done. Okay, but it's better to be smaller, successful steps than giving them an instruction that you can't follow through with. Focus on the positives. Okay, the behavior that you pay attention to the most is the behaviors that you're going to see the most. So when you can focus on the good, you're going to see more good. Okay, there might be days it's like, I like the way your head's on your shoulders. I like the way you just took a deep breath right there. Hey, those might be, but the days that are harder for them are the days they need more access to positive reinforcement and positive comments. Make sure, number 5, that you're fading reinforcement. Okay, or you're going to have that kid that does a task and holds their hand out waiting for candy. We don't need those kids, right? Because they're learning, it turns into bribery. They're learning that, oh, I just have to do this and then you give me something, you know, and it's not intermittent. We want to fade it to where gradually it's like they're doing it and we're going to randomly catch them with reinforcement. Priorities. So making sure that you are prioritizing what you're going to work on. What reinforcers are the highest reinforcers that you're going to use for the hardest things. And then number 7 is no access to reinforcement. And so this might be that it's, okay, we know the kid likes the iPad. So he gets the iPad when he's sitting at the table, not when he's roaming around the room. Okay, or maybe if the child uses the iPad a lot at home and at school, maybe we could make some agreement where, okay, at school where he gets access to these certain apps that he really likes, but we take him off at home. Okay, so anytime you can limit that, you can only control what you can control, but anytime you can limit to where they get their best things for their best work in those school environments, the better off that the power of that reinforcement is going to be. So thinking about, just to wrap it up here, is that when you are seeing some signs of escalation in behavior, and this would be really good to share with teachers, paraprofessionals too, is thinking about, first you have to stop and think. Okay, so really slow down, because thinking about, like, as children escalate in their behavior, often the adults escalate too, and they can feel that. And so even though you're getting stressed, try to take a deep breath and slow down and try to remain as calm as you can. Restate the expected behavior and bring other students on task. So maybe you're recognizing other students for acceptable behavior. So maybe the kids starting to escalate and running around the room. So we are maybe going to start over, reinforcing the kids who are sitting. So I'm going to start looking for the acceptable behavior. Make sure you're speaking privately and acknowledge agitation real calmly. So you're not embarrassing the student. You're not saying, oh, I'm going to call your mom, I'm going to call your dad. You're speaking privately, and you're really acknowledging that they're getting agitated. I can see that you're getting stressed right now. If you have that 5-point, scale, tell me what number you on, what do we need? Isolate, ignore, offer support to the escalating student. So make sure if there needs to be a break, how can we offer any support, or do we need to take them out? Do we need to remove the other students? Give the students a positive choice. So you can either go back to the work or go to the office. So you're giving them choices of things that they can do. Step away and give the student time to respond. Okay. I will give you a chance to think about it, of course, unless it's emergency. And so in one school that I was working, this is what we did: is we wrote out a list, and then we said, okay, I'm going to walk away. I'm only going to tell them one time. I'm going to say first chair and then iPad, because the kid was really wanting the iPad, but we're trying to get him to do something. And so all he had to do was sit in the chair. And so we gave him this instruction real simple. And then we walked away and we set a timer for ourselves, because it seems like it's a long time, but when you really look at it during this time, 2 minutes can seem like a really long time. So we had to set a timer to where we're not going to go over to that student and interact until that 2 minute comes up, because we need to give them some time to de-escalate. If the student then complies, recognize, acknowledge. If the student continues to escalate, implement that any kind of school emergency procedure or behavior intervention plan that you might have. The big thing I've seen with this signs of escalation is really limit the amount of verbal interaction that you're giving the student, because that can make it even worse. And having it to where, one person is interacting with a child, not that child getting it from 5 different people. Okay, so we're making it, we're really, decreasing how much interaction. You'll usually want a couple people there if you're seeing the child escalate quite a bit, but you only want one really interacting. Otherwise, that child can escalate a lot more. Yeah, just be careful to not feed the behavior or give them what they want without some kind of contingency. So as they start to de-escalate, take them back to that activity. You might have to modify it a little bit, but we don't want them to just learn that they completely get out of doing anything, but we want to make sure it's at the right time that they're de-escalated. I'm not showing disappointment or anger, because thinking about this is the only tool that they have. And so we don't want to be condescending. We don't want to lecture, threaten, because that will most likely trigger that behavior to happen again, and it won't help you the next time. Try not to physically intervene if all possible, especially if you haven't been trained in any kind of CPI or anything like that. But making sure we're just giving them space and that we're really decreasing the amount of interactions during that time. So just in a summary, all behavior serves a purpose. So really, when you're thinking about challenging behavior now, thinking about, what are they trying to tell us? We're looking at that behavior, objectively. So we're looking at what happens before, what happens after, And we're always reevaluating that hypothesis. So thinking about, okay, we thought he was doing it for attention, but if we give him attention, it keeps happening. Well, maybe it's not about attention. Maybe he's trying to escape. Okay, so let's change our hypothesis. Let's change our strategies and see if that changes the behavior. So you constantly want to be looking at that. Look at updating that plan if it doesn't decrease, and just trying to find a plan that everybody can be consistent with. Because kids learn, students learn. Who they can get away with what with, and how they can get support from different people. So the more consistent that we can all be, the better that we can help support challenging behavior. Okay, so our next virtual training will be in October. We will send you a email reminder about that. We're going to talk about strength-based writing, and we'll do it again on the second Tuesday of October from 12 to 1, and you'll get a email reminder about it as well. And it's October 8th. Okay. And like I said, we recorded this, so we will put it into a YouTube video that you can share with other people, and we'll send this out. So thank you guys and for joining, and you guys have a great day.